The growl came out of the darkness like a blade drawn from a sheath, low and rolling, and Emmett Shelby froze with one boot still on the ferry deck, and the other hovering over the mooring plank, certain in that instant that he was about to die on the muddy bank of the Sable River with a lantern in one hand and a coil of wet rope in the other. He had poled the ferry in late, later than he liked, the last barge of the evening loaded with 3 casks of apple brandy, and a crate of iron nails bound for the harvest fair stalls going up on the flat beyond the willows. The moon had not yet cleared the ridge, and the reeds along the landing hissed with a wind that smelled of wood smoke and river mud. He had just set his lantern down on the piling to free both hands for the rope when the sound rolled out of the black tangle of brush to his left, deep and guttural, the kind of sound a man felt in his back teeth before he understood it with his ears. He did not think. He dropped the rope and swung the lantern up like a club, his other hand fumbling for the skinning knife at his belt, and he shouted something that was not even a word, just a raw burst of alarm, and he took a stumbling step backward that put his heel right at the edge of the planking with nothing behind it but 6 feet of cold black water. "Do not move," a voice said, and it was not the growl, it was a woman's voice, deep and rough-edged but unmistakably a woman, speaking clipped trade tongue with the accent of the high borderlands. "Do not move your foot, little ferryman, or you will learn to swim badly." He froze again, this time from confusion rather than fear, and that was when she stepped out of the reeds into the low spill of his lantern light, and Emmett Shelby's mind simply stopped working for the length of 3 full heartbeats. She was enormous, not in the way of a fat man or a bear, but in the way of something built by a careful hand out of good hard stone, tall enough that she had to duck beneath the low willow branch overhanging the path, with shoulders that filled the space where a normal person's shoulders would be and then kept filling it. Her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered like old bronze at the cheekbones, and her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder and was threaded through with small bones and a single dull copper ring. She wore fitted leather traveling armor. A cuirass lay snug over a dark forest green tunic that clung to the strong lines of her, wide leather bracers at her wrists, and supple leggings tucked into tall boots scuffed pale at the toes from long roads. A wide belt sat low on her hips, twin curved daggers sheathed at either side, and even standing still she moved like something that had never once in its life needed to hurry. Her tusks caught the lantern light when she spoke again, and her eyes, a startling amber gold, were fixed not on his knife but on the ground 3 feet in front of his heel. "There," she said, and pointed with 2 fingers. "Iron teeth. Poacher's trap, old but still hungry. You were about to put your foot in it." Emmett looked down. In the tangle of grass at the very edge of the plank sat a rusted bear trap, jaws cocked open, half buried in mud and leaves exactly where his next step would have carried his boot. "That growl," he said, his voice cracking absurdly in the middle of the sentence, "that was you, warning me." "Warning you," she agreed, though something flickered across her face, quick as a fish under water, something that might have been surprise at her own action. "You walk like a man who does not look at the ground he stands on. I was looking at the rope." "Then look at both next time, or the river will have a ferryman with 1 foot." He let out a breath that shuddered on the way out, lowered the lantern, and only then noticed his own hand was still white-knuckled around the handle of his skinning knife, held up between them like he actually meant to use it on her. Heat crawled up the back of his neck. He sheathed it, fumbling, and it took him 2 tries to get the tip into the leather. "I am sorry," he said. I heard that sound and I thought you meant to kill you." She said it flatly, without malice, but there was an edge underneath it, old and tired, the edge of a woman who had heard that particular fear 1,000 times before from 1,000 men just like him. "Yes, I understand what you thought. It is a fair thing to think, out here in the dark, hearing a growl like that. It was not a battle growl." The words came out sharper than she seemed to intend, and she stopped, drew a slow breath through her nose, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped, quieter, almost private, as though she were correcting herself as much as him. "That growl, it is not for fighting. It is the sound my mother's mother taught to my mother, and my mother taught to me. The sound you make low in the chest when someone you would not want harmed is about to walk into harm. A warning growl, not a threat growl. There is a difference in the shape of it in the throat if you know how to hear it. Humans rarely do." Emmett stood very still, the lantern light flickering gold across both their faces, and found he could not look away from her. "Someone I would not want harmed," he repeated slowly. "You don't know me." She opened her mouth to answer, and then seemed to hear, a half-breath too late, exactly what she had said and exactly how it sounded, and something extraordinary happened to her face. The green of her cheeks darkened, a flush rising up from her throat to the tips of her rounded ears, and she looked, for one unguarded instant, entirely mortified. "It is instinct," she said quickly, too quickly. "It means nothing. Any decent creature warns another from a trap. It is not. It does not mean." She stopped herself again, jaw tightening, clearly furious at her own tongue for tripping over itself in front of a stranger, and a human stranger at that. "I am Vragesh Stonefist of the Ironhoof clan, captain of the honor guard to the treaty delegation. I came to scout the crossing before the fair traffic clogs it. That is all. That is the whole of it." "Emmett Shelby," he managed, and because his hands did not seem to know what else to do with themselves, he stuck one out toward her, the way his father had taught him to greet any soul he met on the water, orc or human or anything else, and then immediately felt like a fool for it, certain she would look at his offered hand like it was something to be broken. Instead, she looked at it for a long moment, then reached out and closed her huge calloused hand around his, and her grip was careful, far more careful than he expected from someone who could have crushed his fingers to paste without trying. "You run the ferry," she said. "It was not quite a question. Every day since I was 15. My father ran it before me. Now it's just me and a stubborn mule named Barley who thinks he owns the winch." He heard himself babbling and could not seem to stop. "You'll be needing to cross the delegation's wagons come morning, I expect, for the fair. 3 wagons. Trade goods, cured hides, carved horn, dried mountain herbs the healers in your towns pay well for. And my people, who your fair council has sworn under treaty to let walk your streets unmolested." Something bitter crept into the last words, quickly smoothed over, the practiced neutrality of someone who had said such sentences many times to many doubtful faces. "We shall see if that oath holds better than the last one did. I'll get you across safe," Emmett said, and meant it with a suddenness and a certainty that surprised even himself. "Whatever else this fair brings, I promise you that. Every wagon, every soul, safe across the water on my ferry." She studied him then, this green-eyed river man half her size with mud on his boots and a knife he did not know how to properly hold, and something in her expression shifted, softened at the edges, though her chin stayed high and proud. A bold promise from a man who nearly put his own foot in an iron trap not 5 minutes past. "I've made worse promises with less reason." The ghost of a smile touched her mouth, there and gone, and she stepped back from the light, back toward the trees where the rest of the night waited. "Fill in that trap before another fool finds it in the dark, ferryman. I will see you at first light, with 3 wagons and no patience for delays." "I'll be here," he called after her, and stood for a long while after she had gone, staring at the black water, feeling his heart still going too fast, and not entirely because of the trap. The Sable Crossing Harvest Fair had not been held in 6 years, not since the border wars had burned 3 villages upriver and left the treaty between the human towns and the Highland clans hanging by threads thinner than spider silk. And so, when word went out that the fair would return this autumn, and that it would return with the Ironhoof clan's blessing and trade goods both, half the county turned out to see it. Whether from hope of good bargains or simple hunger to gawk at orc traders, walking free among human stalls for the first time in a generation. Emmett had ferried more people in wagons in the 3 days since Vragesh Stonefist stepped out of the reeds than he usually saw in a full month, and his shoulders ached with the poling of it, and Barley the mule had worn a permanent look of long-suffering disgust at the winch. But Emmett found he did not much mind the work, because it meant the ferry crossed and recrossed all day, and more often than not the delegation's wagons crossed with it. And more often than not Vragesh Stonefist stood at the rail beside him, while the water slid by beneath the planks. She did not speak much on those crossings at first. She stood with her arms folded and her eyes on the far bank, watchful in the way of a soldier who had never once in her life allowed herself to relax fully in unfamiliar territory, and Emmett respected that too much to press her with chatter. But he noticed things. He noticed she always positioned herself so she could see both banks and the water at once. He noticed the way her hand drifted to the hilt of a dagger whenever a human crowd grew loud on the shore, though she never once drew it. He noticed, on the second day, that she had begun to stand a little closer to him at the rail than strictly necessary, close enough that he could smell the leather and wood smoke, and something underneath that was warm and clean, like sun-baked stone. On the third crossing of the third day, with the fairgrounds finally rising ahead of them in a sprawl of striped tents and cook-fire smoke and pens of prize livestock, she finally spoke first. "Your mule hates me," she said. Emmett laughed before he could help it. "Barley hates everyone. It's not personal. He bit the fair magistrate's own son last spring for trying to feed him a green apple." "Good," Vragesh said. "I approve of a creature with proper judgment about which humans deserve biting. Careful, I'm a human." "You," she said, and there was something almost teasing in the low rumble of her voice, "have not yet earned biting. You have only earned mild suspicion. High praise coming from you. The highest I give." He glanced sideways at her, at the strong, clean line of her jaw and the amber eyes fixed now, deliberately, on him instead of the far bank, and felt something turn over slow and warm in his chest, something he had no ready name for, and was a little afraid to look at too closely. The fairgrounds themselves sprawled across the flat meadow beyond the willows, a small chaotic kingdom of canvas and rope and noise. Cattle lowed in their pens. A juggler in a patched red coat tossed knives near the cider stall to the delighted horror of a crowd of children. Somewhere a fiddle sawed out a reel, and somewhere else a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil, and the whole sprawling mess of it smelled of roasting corn and crushed apples and horse dung, and underneath it all, the sharp mineral tang of the river. The orc delegation's wagons drew stairs the moment they rolled up onto the fairground road, stairs that ranged from wary to openly hostile, and Emmett watched Vragesh's spine straighten, and her face go carefully, deliberately blank as she walked at the head of her small guard of 6 warriors, escorting the trade wagons past stalls where merchants' hands drifted instinctively toward the knives they kept beneath their counters. An old woman selling pickled eggs made a warning sign with 2 fingers as the orcs passed. A cluster of young men near the horseshoe pitch went quiet and hard-eyed, one of them spitting into the dust. Emmett left Barley and the ferry in the charge of his hired boy and walked alongside the delegation without quite deciding to, matching his stride to Vragesh's, and if anyone thought it strange to see the ferryman walking so close to the fearsome orc captain, no one said so to his face. "They look at us like we came to burn their barns," Vragesh muttered, low enough for only him to hear. "Give them a season," Emmett said. "Fear takes longer to unlearn than a treaty takes to sign, but it can be unlearned. I've seen stranger things change." "Have you?" she said, not quite a question, something wry in it, and she looked at him again in that considering way she had, as though he were a puzzle she had not yet decided whether to solve or simply admire. They found the Fairwarden's tent at the center of the grounds, and there Emmett was introduced, formally this time, to the man responsible for the fair's running, a stout, kind-faced official named Toller Briggs, who shook Vragesh's hand with only the faintest hesitation and welcomed her delegation with what seemed like genuine relief. "6 years I've waited to see this fair full again," Briggs said, mopping his brow with a kerchief despite the cool autumn air. "The council fought me tooth and claw over letting your people trade this year, Captain Stonefist, but I told them, I said, A fair with no orc horn carvers and no mountain herbs is half a fair, and a piece that can't survive a market day isn't much of a piece at all. Some among your council disagree with you, Vragesh said. I have felt their eyes. Some among my council, Briggs said, and here his kind face grew troubled, have disagreed rather more loudly than I like of late. Alderman Prout chief among them. He lost his brother at Kettle Ridge in the war, and I don't fault a man his grief, but he's been making noise about there being no proper accounting of who comes and goes on your side of the treaty line, hinting at smuggled weapons under the trade goods, that sort of talk. I've told him there's no evidence of any such thing, but the man doesn't listen to evidence when his blood's up. Something crossed Vragesh's face, quick and sharp, though she smoothed it almost instantly. We carry no weapons beyond what my guard wears openly for our own protection. Every crate was opened and inspected by your own border wardens before we crossed the flatlands. I know it, Captain, I know it, Briggs said. I only tell you so you're not surprised if you catch a cold look from the alderman's direction. Man's got a chip on his shoulder the size of a felled oak. Emmett filed the name away without quite knowing why it snagged in him like a splinter, but he would remember it later, remember it very clearly indeed, when the splinter finally worked its way to the surface. That evening, with the wagons unloaded and the delegation's tents pitched at the edge of the fairgrounds beneath a stand of old oaks, Emmett found himself lingering long after his ferry duties were done, drawn back across the fair like a man walking toward a fire on a cold night, and he told himself it was only to make certain the wagons had crossed without damage, though he knew, and suspected she knew too, that it was not really that at all. He found Vragesh sitting alone on an overturned crate outside her tent, sharpening one of her curved daggers with slow, practiced strokes of a whetstone, the firelight from a nearby cook pit turning her green skin to warm bronze. "You are still here, ferryman," she said without looking up. "Emmett," he said, "you could use my name. I've earned that much at least, haven't I? More than mild suspicion by now." She looked up then, and the corner of her mouth curved, slow and deliberate. "Emmett," she said, testing the shape of it, and something in the way she said it made the back of his neck go warm. "Sit if you intend to hover like a nervous heron. It is unbecoming." He sat on the grass near her crate, close enough to feel the warmth of the cook fire, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it was, strangely, one of the most comfortable silences he had known in years. "Tell me of your fare," she said eventually. "What happens here besides the buying and selling? There's a bonfire on the last night, music, dancing, a wrestling ring where half the young fools in the county try to break their arms proving something to somebody, a prize for the best harvest bread judged by the fairwarden's wife, who I happen to know cannot bake to save her own life but takes the honor very seriously regardless." He glanced sideways at her. "You could come to the bonfire if your captain's duties allow it." "You are asking me to dance, ferryman." "I'm asking if you'd come and watch other fools try. I don't dance. I have 2 left feet and a mule's grace." "A pity," she said, and there was something low and rich in her voice that made his pulse trip over itself. "I had thought perhaps you were building toward something bolder than that." He felt his ears go hot. "Would you say yes if I were?" She set down the whetstone and the dagger both, and turned to look at him fully, firelight dancing gold in her amber eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only looked at him with an intensity that made him feel entirely seen, entirely known, in a way no one had ever quite managed before. "Perhaps," she said finally, "you should ask boldly and find out." He did not yet, though the question hung between them like something alive for the rest of that evening, and when he finally rose to walk back toward the ferry landing in the dark, she walked with him partway unasked, her long strides matching his without effort, and at the edge of the oak stand she stopped him with a hand on his arm. "That trap you nearly stepped in," she said. "The night we met, I have been thinking on it." "So have I," he admitted. "It was old, rusted through at one hinge. A trap like that has sat unused for years, forgotten by whatever poacher set it." Her eyes searched his face in the dark. or placed there recently, freshly baited with rust to look old, by someone who knew the delegation would cross that landing and wished for an accident to sour the treaty before it had properly begun. Emmett went very still. You think someone said it on purpose, to hurt one of your people, or me? I think, Vragesh said slowly, that a man who lost his brother in a war against my people and who does not trust evidence when his blood is up might find a quiet trap in the dark a very convenient sort of accident. Prude. I do not know yet, but I have not survived as long as I have by ignoring the shape of things that fit together too neatly. She held his gaze. Watch yourself, Emmett Shelby, and watch the ground you walk on. I will not always be near enough to growl a warning. I'll take my chances on you being near enough, he said, and meant it more than he expected to, and she huffed something that was almost a laugh, low and warm, before melting back into the dark toward her tent. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Emmett would later remember as some of the finest of his life, though danger moved beneath the surface of them the whole while like a current under calm water. He ferried Fairgors across the Sable from dawn until the light failed, and whenever the delegation's business brought Vragesh to the landing, she found reasons to linger, and he found reasons to let her, and slowly, crossing by crossing, the wary distance between them wore away like a riverbank under steady current. She taught him, one slow afternoon between crossings, the proper shape of an orc warning growl, guiding 2 fingers to his own throat to show him where the sound should live, and laughed outright, a full rich sound that startled a heron off the bank, when his attempt came out sounding like a man choking on a fish bone. He taught her in turn how to properly hold a fishing line, and she caught nothing all afternoon and blamed the river rather than her own impatience, and when he teased her for it she shoved him, not hard, but enough that he nearly went into the water, and grabbed his collar at the last instant to haul him back, and they stood there laughing, her hand still fisted in his shirt, close enough that the laughter died between them into something else, something charged and waiting. Before a shout from the fairgrounds broke the moment and she released him, though not before her thumb had brushed, deliberate or not, along his jaw. He began to notice, too, things that troubled him. A merchant's stall selling orc-carved horn combs mysteriously catching fire in the night, the blaze blamed on a careless lantern though Emmett had seen no lantern near it. A rumor, spreading through the fairgrounds like rot through grain, that orc traders had been seen sharpening blades near the children's tents, a rumor that traced back, when he pulled at its thread, to no one who had actually witnessed any such thing. Alderman Josiah Prude himself, a lean, hard-faced man with cold eyes, appearing at the edges of these small disasters with an expression of grim vindication, as though each one proved something he had known all along. Emmett brought each of these threads to Vragesh, and she listened with a stillness that frightened him more than any shout would have, because it was the stillness of a warrior calculating a battlefield. "He wants a spark," she said, after the third such incident, standing with him beneath the oaks at dusk. "Enough sparks and the whole fair burns, and my people take the blame whether they deserve it or not, and the treaty dies before it has drawn a full season's breath. I have seen this before, Emmett. In the last war before it was a war, small sparks until the whole field is fire. Then we find who's striking the flint," Emmett said, "together. I know this fair, every stall and face in it. You know the shape of a lie built to look like an accident. Between the 2 of us we'll see him coming." She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and entirely unguarded moving behind her eyes. "You did not have to make this your fight, ferryman. It is not your treaty being tested. It is not your people being watched for the first excuse to hate them again. It's my fair," he said simply, "my river. And you," he added quieter, "are not nothing to me, Vragesh Stonefist, whatever else is true. I'll not stand by while someone tries to burn down everything you're here to build." She stepped closer to him then, closer than the moment strictly required, close enough that he had to tip his head back to hold her gaze, and for a breathless span of time neither of them moved, the noise of the fair distant and unimportant around them. "You are a strange little ferryman," she murmured, "bold in ways I did not expect from something so easily fit beneath my arm." "I contain multitudes," he said, voice not quite steady. She laughed, low and warm, and this time when she leaned down, it was not laughter that finished the motion. Her mouth found his, firm and certain, tasting faintly of the mountain tea she favored, and Emmett's hands came up to grip her forearms not to steady himself, but because he did not trust his knees, and the kiss went on long enough that the fair noise faded to nothing at all around them. When she finally drew back, her forehead resting against his, her breath a little unsteady for the first time since he had known her, she said, "That ferryman was not an accident either." "Good," he managed. "I'd hate to think I imagined it." The night of the great bonfire arrived 3 days later, the last night of the fair, and the whole meadow filled with light and music and the smell of roasting chestnuts. And Emmett stood at the edge of the dancing ring with Vragesh beside him, her presence drawing looks from every direction, some curious, some still cold, but fewer hostile than there had been on the first day, and he counted that a small victory worth having. It was into that same firelit crowd that the shout went up, sudden and ugly, cutting through the fiddle music like a knife through cloth. "Thief! There's a thief among the orc wagons, and worse than a thief." The crowd's attention swung as one body toward the sound, and Emmett felt Vragesh go rigid beside him an instant before he saw the cause. Alderman Josiah Prout striding into the firelight with 2 of the fair's watchmen at his heels, and between them, hauled roughly by the arm, one of the orc delegation's own guardsmen, a young warrior named Kelger, Vragesh's own cousin's son, his wrists already bound with rope. "Found in the merchant Hendrick's stall not an hour past," Prout announced, loud enough to carry across the whole meadow, with the prize harvest silver cup in his pack, the very cup meant for tomorrow's judging, and a knife drawn against the merchant who caught him at it. An orc, thieving and threatening violence, not 3 days after we opened our gates to his kind in good faith. The crowd's murmur turned ugly fast, a low, ugly muttering that rippled outward through the firelight, and Emmett felt the whole temperature of the gathering shift, felt old fear surfacing in 100 faces at once like something long submerged, finally breaking the water's skin. "That is a lie," Vragesh said, and her voice cut across the crowd with a captain's authority, silencing the nearest ring of onlookers. "Kelger has stood guard at my own tent every hour since sundown. I set the watch myself. He has not been within 100 paces of the merchant stalls tonight." "Are you calling my watchmen liars, orc?" Prout's voice rose, thick with something that might have been triumph. "Or perhaps you'd have us believe your kind incapable of theft, incapable of violence, when half this county still bears the scars your people carved into it not 6 years past." The crowd surged closer, and Emmett saw hands drifting toward pitchfork handles left leaning against the cider cart, saw torches lifted from their stands, saw the whole gathering tip toward something that could not be walked back once it began, and Vragesh stepped forward, chin high, one hand raised, not toward a weapon, he realized with a jolt of fierce pride, but empty and open, showing the crowd she meant no violence even as they closed around her like a fist. "Search me," she said, loud and clear. "Search my tent, my guard, every wagon we brought across that river, and if you find one stolen thing among them, I will kneel before this whole fair and accept whatever justice you demand. But you will not condemn my cousin's son on the word of a man who has hated my people since before this boy was old enough to hold a blade." Bold words from a beast who, Prout began, and that was when Emmett Shelby, ferryman, a man who had never in his life raised his voice to a crowd or stood against more than 3 people at once, stepped directly between Vragesh Stonefist and the alderman, and the surging edge of the mob, and put his back to her and his face to all of them. "I ferried that boy across this river myself, not 2 hours before this cup went missing," Emmett said, his voice shaking but carrying farther than he thought himself capable of. "I stood at my own landing and watched him take the watch at Captain Stonefist's tent, and I did not leave that landing until after the bell for full dark had rung. If he stole that cup, he did it while standing guard a quarter-mile from the merchant's stalls, in full view of 6 of his own kin who will say the same as I do. And what would a ferryman know of orc honesty? Someone shouted from the crowd. Sweet on the she-beast as everyone's seen him mooning about all week. Laughter rippled through the crowd, ugly and mocking, but Emmett did not flinch, did not move from where he stood between Vragesh and the gathered torches. I know, he said, louder now, steadier, that I have crossed this river 10,000 times and never once needed a lie to get me through it. I know Captain Stonefist has stood at that landing every dawn this week to make certain her people crossed peacefully, has answered every cruel look thrown her way with nothing but patience, has kept a treaty that half this crowd seems eager to break for the pleasure of an old grudge. And I know that a man with a grudge sharp enough to grieve 6 years, past its cause, is exactly the sort of man who might plant a cup in an innocent boy's pack to see that grudge satisfied. The crowd's mutter shifted, uncertain now, some faces turning from Vragesh toward Prut instead, and the alderman's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something cornered crossing his hard features before he smoothed it away. Preposterous, Prut snapped. Search the wagons, then, if the ferryman is so certain, and we shall see whose honesty holds water. Search them, Vragesh agreed, stepping up beside Emmett now rather than behind him, her shoulder nearly brushing his, a united front the whole crowd could see. Search every crate, but know that I will remember, alderman, exactly who called for torches against an unarmed boy before a single crate was opened. Fairward and Briggs arrived then at a dead run, pushing through the crowd with 2 more watchmen and a face gone pale with alarm, and under his direction the wagons were searched, crate by crate, in the flickering light of a dozen torches while the whole fair watched in tense, breathless silence, Emmett standing at Vragesh's side the entire time, close enough that his shoulder did brush hers now, and he did not step away, not once, no matter how many eyes marked the fact. No stolen cup was found among the orc wagons. It took nearly an hour of increasingly frantic searching before one of Briggs' watchmen, checking the merchant Hendrick's own stall a second time at Vragesh's quiet insistence, found the silver cup wedged beneath a false bottom in Hendrick's own strongbox, alongside a folded letter bearing Alderman Prut's own seal, promising the merchant a generous purse for his trouble in helping settle the orc question before it settles us. The silence that fell over the meadow when Briggs read that letter aloud by torchlight was the loudest silence Emmett had ever heard in his life. Prut did not wait to be seized. He turned and ran, shoving through the stunned crowd toward the horse lines at the edge of the fairgrounds, and it was Vragesh who moved first, faster than anything her size had any right to move, closing the distance in a handful of long strides, and catching the fleeing alderman by the back of his coat before he ever reached a saddle, hauling him bodily off his feet, and depositing him on the ground before the fair watchman with no more effort than a man setting down a sack of grain. "You will answer for this before the fair council," she said, standing over him, "and before the treaty magistrates both, and you will do it standing, not running like the coward you have shown yourself to be." The crowd, which only an hour before had stood ready to burn her out with torches, now stood in stunned, shamed silence, and somewhere in the back of the gathering, an old woman began hesitantly to clap, and the sound spread through the meadow like fire catching dry grass, though this fire, Emmett thought, burned toward something good. Kelger's bonds were cut by Briggs' own hand, the young guardsman shaking with reaction as his kin gathered around him, and Vragesh turned from Prut's prone, humiliated form to find Emmett still standing exactly where he had planted himself, watching her with an expression of such open, fierce pride that it stole the breath from her chest. "You stood against your own people for me," she said, quiet now, the crowd noise falling away around them as though they stood alone in the firelight. "Against a mob with torches. You are no warrior, Emmett Shelby. You told me so yourself the very first night we met, fumbling with a knife you did not know how to hold, and yet you stood." I wasn't standing against my people, he said. I was standing for what's right. Sometimes that happens to look the same as standing against a crowd, but it isn't the same thing at all. He reached up, hesitant, and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her face where it had come loose from her braid in the chaos. I told you I'd get every soul across that river safe. I didn't say I'd only manage it on the water. The scandal of that night became, within days, the single most discussed event the Sable Crossing Harvest Fair had ever produced, retold at every hearth and tavern for 100 miles. The story of the ferryman who stood alone against a mob to defend an orc captain and her falsely accused kin. The corrupt alderman exposed by torchlight with a stolen cup, and a damning letter both. The treaty saved at the very edge of collapse by the stubborn courage of a man half the size of the woman he stood beside. Some tellings made Emmett braver than he had felt in the moment. Some made Vragesh more terrible in her fury than she had truly been. All of them agreed on one thing, that whatever had passed between the human ferryman and the orc captain, it was no small or passing thing, and the whole fair had watched it happen in the open by firelight for anyone to see. Prout was taken before the treaty magistrates the following morning, his confession dragged out of him within the hour, once the sealed letter and Hendrik's own frightened testimony were laid before him, the whole plot unspooling like a badly tied knot. He had lost his brother at Kettle Ridge in the border wars, true enough, and had never forgiven the peace that followed, had spent 6 years watching the treaty talks with growing horror, certain that any lasting peace dishonored his brother's memory, and when the Fair Council voted to allow the Ironhoof clan's trade delegation, something in him had broken past reason entirely. He had paid Hendricks to plant the stolen cup, had set the old trap fresh-baited near the ferry landing hoping to injure or kill a member of the delegation before the fair even properly began, had spread the poisoned rumors about sharpened blades near the children's tents, all of it building toward a single desperate hope, that enough small sparks would catch, and the treaty would burn, and the war he still fought in his own grieving heart might somehow be justified after all. He was stripped of his aldermanship and exiled from the county by unanimous vote of the Fair Council, and though some quiet part of Emmett pitied the ruin of a man so consumed by old grief, he found he could not summon much sympathy for what Prout's schemes had nearly cost, not when he thought of Kelger's bound wrists, or the torches lifted against Vragesh in the firelight, or the trap that had waited in the mud for his own unwary foot the very first night they met. The Fair Council, in the aftermath, voted something else as well, a formal apology to the Ironhoof clan delegation, delivered by Fairwarden Briggs himself before the assembled crowd, and an invitation, unprecedented in the county's history, for the clan to return the following year not merely as trade guests, but as honored participants in the fair's own governance, a seat on the very council that had so nearly betrayed them. Vragesh accepted that invitation on her clan's behalf with a dignity that made Emmett's chest ache with pride to witness, and when the formal business was concluded and the crowd began to disperse back to their stalls and wagons, she found him waiting at the edge of the gathering, and did not wait for him to speak first. "Come," she said, and took his hand in hers, right there before whatever remained of the crowd's attention, without hesitation or apology. "There is a custom of my people I would show you, ferryman, if you are willing." "I'm willing," he said, without needing to ask what it was, because he had already decided, somewhere in the chaos of the last hour, that he would follow this woman into far stranger customs than whatever waited for him now. She led him beneath the old oaks at the edge of the delegation's camp, away from the last stragglers of the fair, to where a small fire burned low in a ring of river stones, and there she knelt and drew from a pouch at her belt a length of braided leather cord, dark red, worked through with a single small carved bead of pale horn. "Among my clan," she said, kneeling so that her eyes were nearly level with his, "when a warrior chooses a mate, she does not ask permission of councils or elders. She does not wait to be chosen in turn, though she hopes for it. She simply chooses, and she says so plainly, and lets the one she has chosen decide what to do with the truth of it. She held up the cord. I am choosing you, Emmett Shelby. Not because you stood against a mob, though you did, and not because you make me laugh, though you do that too, more than anyone has in longer than I care to admit. I am choosing you because from the very first night, when I meant only to warn a clumsy stranger from a trap in the dark, some part of me already knew I did not want that stranger harmed in any sense ever, and that knowing has only grown truer every single day since. Emmett's throat had gone too tight to speak for a long moment, and when he finally found his voice it came out rough and unsteady. That growl, he said. The one that scared 10 years off my life. You said it was the sound your mother taught your mother, for warning someone you'd not want harmed. You knew, that first night, before either of us had said a proper word to each other. I did not want to know it, she admitted, a small rueful smile touching her mouth. It was inconvenient. You are a human and small, and you did not even know how to hold your own knife properly. It made no sense to me at all. And yet, she reached out and took his hand again, turning it palm up, and began to wind the braided cord around his wrist, her huge, careful fingers working the knot with a tenderness that undid something in his chest completely. Here it makes sense. It has made sense since the first night, whatever my sense tried to argue otherwise. Vragash, he said, and stopped, because there did not seem to be words large enough for what he felt. So instead he simply reached up with his free hand and cupped her jaw, drawing her down to him, and kissed her there beneath the oaks with the last of the fair's firelight glowing gold and distant behind them, kissed her slow and certain and entirely unhurried, the way a man kisses something he has already decided he will spend the rest of his days choosing again and again. When they finally parted, her forehead resting against his, her breath coming a little rough, she said low, I am not a gentle woman, Emmett Shelby. I do not know how to want things quietly. When I want, I take, and I have never once in my life pretended otherwise to make some smaller soul comfortable. Good, he said, and meant it entirely. I've spent my whole life being overlooked, being the sort of man people forget is even standing in the room. I don't want quiet. I don't want careful. I want exactly what you just said. I want to be wanted the way you want things, plainly, without apology. Her answering smile was fierce and warm and entirely hers, and she rose, drawing him up with her by the hand still bound in her cord, and did not let go of him as they walked together back toward her tent beneath the darkening oaks, the sounds of the fair's last celebrations fading soft and distant behind them, the whole rest of the night stretching out ahead like a river with no far bank in sight. And what passed between them there, in the warm dark beneath canvas and starlight, was neither hurried nor careful, but full of a hunger long banked and finally allowed to burn, tender in its ferocity, certain in its claiming, and when dawn found them tangled together with her braid come loose, entirely across his chest, and his hand resting easy over the strong, steady beat of her heart, neither of them had slept more than a handful of hours, and neither of them minded in the slightest. The fair struck its tents 3 days later, wagons rolling out in every direction back toward their home villages and highland camps, and Emmett stood at his ferry landing, helping load the last of the iron-hoofed delegation's crates aboard for the crossing, watching Vragash direct her guard with the same crisp authority she had shown the very first morning he met her, though everything between them had changed in the weeks since. You'll need a ferry crossing again come spring, he said, when the last crate was secured and the wagon stood ready to board, for the treaty council seat, someone reliable to see you and your people safe across the water. I had thought, Vragash said, of asking the current ferryman if he might consider a rather more permanent arrangement than a single crossing. What sort of arrangement? The sort where he does not stay behind on this bank when the wagons roll north come spring, but comes with them instead, and sees for himself the mountains his mate calls home, and perhaps discovers whether a river man makes half so poor a rider as he claims to be with a knife. Emmett stared at her, heart hammering. You're asking me to leave the ferry, leave Sable Crossing. "I am asking you to come with me," she corrected, stepping close, taking his face in both huge, careful hands. "There will be other rivers, Emmett. Other crossings if that is the life you still want, and I would not ask you to give it up entirely if it is truly what your heart needs. But I have watched you these past weeks fill your days with everyone else's crossings, everyone else's needs, and I would see you choose, for once, a road that is only for the two of us. I have duties to my clan, and you have built a life on this water, and I am not so foolish as to think either of those things vanishes simply because we have found each other. But I would rather walk toward both futures with you beside me than stand still on one riverbank hoping you might follow when duty allows." Emmett looked past her, at Barley grazing contentedly by the winch post, at the familiar worn planks of the ferry deck he had walked 10,000 times, at the whole small steady life he had built alone on this water for so many years he had stopped noticing how quiet it truly was. Then he looked back at her, at the fierce open want in her amber eyes, want that asked nothing of him but his presence, offered everything of hers in return, and he found the choice was not nearly so difficult as he might once have imagined. "I'll teach my hired boy the winch properly," he said. "He's been wanting more work anyway, and Barley likes him well enough not to bite him more than twice a week. The ferry will still run. But I think," he added, feeling something loosen and lift in his chest that he had carried so long he had forgotten its weight, "I think I've spent long enough being the man who stays on one bank waiting for the world to come to him. I'd like to see what's on the other side of that mountain road, Vragesh Stonefist, if you'll have me riding beside you to see it." "I have already had you," she said, low and warm, tugging him close by the braided cord still wound about his wrist, "and I intend to keep having you, ferryman, for a very long time yet." He laughed, full and unguarded, and kissed her there on the landing in plain sight of her whole delegation and half the fairgoers still loading wagons for the road. And if any of them thought it strange to see the county's ferryman kissed breathless by the fearsome orc captain who had so recently stood accused of stealing silver cups and threatening violence, none of them said so, because by now the whole fair had already decided that whatever story this particular pair intended to write together, it was going to be one worth watching unfold. They crossed the Sable River together that afternoon, the ferry loaded with the last of the delegation's wagons, Emmett at the pole and Vragesh at the rail beside him, exactly where she had stood every crossing since that first startled night in the reeds. And when they reached the far bank, and the wagons rolled off onto the northern road toward the distant blue shadow of the Highland Mountains, Emmett secured his ferry, handed the pole and the winch and the whole quiet weight of his old life over to his grinning hired boy, and swung up onto the spare horse Vragesh had saddled for him without asking, because she had known somehow, before he had fully known it himself, that he would say yes. The road north climbed slowly out of the river valley, autumn color blazing gold and red across the hills, the mountains growing closer and sharper against the sky with every mile, and Vragesh rode beside him with her braid loose in the wind, and a smile on her face he suspected few outside her own clan had ever been permitted to see. And Emmett Shelby, once the overlooked ferryman of a small crossing town, once a man who had grown so used to solitude he had stopped noticing its ache, felt for the first time in longer than he could remember entirely, completely, unmistakably found. "Second thoughts?" Vragesh asked, glancing over at him as the road bent north into the trees. "Not one," Emmett said, and reached across the space between their horses to take her hand, and she let him, twining her huge, careful fingers through his without hesitation, and together they rode on, toward the mountains, toward whatever came next, chasing a horizon that neither of them intended to face alone ever again.